The fluorescent hum of the night shift at Allied Hypermart was a constant companion, a sterile lullaby for the graveyard crew. John, fresh out of college and burdened by student loans, found himself swallowed by its cavernous, echoing aisles. It was a place of endless restocking, a silent ballet of pallets and price tags under the cold, indifferent gaze of security cameras. He'd been there 3 weeks, just long enough for the initial novelty of solitude to wear off, replaced by a creeping sense of isolation. The vastness of the store at 3 a.m. felt less like an opportunity and more like an empty tomb. Every squeak of his cart, every distant clatter seemed amplified in the silence. The veteran employees, grizzled and cynical, had warned him about the boredom, the aches, the endless parade of bizarre discoveries. But they'd also whispered of other things, hushed warnings about certain areas of the colossal building, places not meant for the likes of him or anyone else after the sun went down. One of these whispers concerned the seventh aisle, a place no one could quite pinpoint on any map, but everyone knew existed. It was always mentioned with a shiver, a quick glance over the shoulder, as if the very thought of it could conjure something from the shadows. A place where the light seemed to die, and the cameras simply didn't see. His first encounter with the anomalous came not from a direct confrontation, but from a persistent, unsettling pattern. Each morning, just before his shift ended, he'd find items out of place. Not just misplaced, but wrong. A vintage porcelain doll, its eyes gouged out, sitting on a shelf of fresh produce. A rusted tin soldier with a missing arm, perched atop a stack of glossy magazines. He'd point them out to his supervisor, who would sigh, muttering about late-night pranksters or confused elderly shoppers. But John knew better. These weren't random acts of mischief. These objects felt ancient, imbued with a strange, heavy silence that clung to them like dust. They were always found near the invisible boundary of the Lost Stockroom. The thing was, they always reappeared the next night.
The morning John expected to see the doll again, he found a replacement. Not antique, but recent. A child's brightly colored lunchbox sat precisely where the doll had been, but it was smashed flat, its plastic surface melted and distorted as if exposed to impossible heat. He immediately took it to his team lead, an older man named Gary, who had worked nights for decades. Gary didn't even lift his eyes from his clipboard. He simply pointed towards the dimly lit passage leading to the unmapped area. "Put it back where you found it, John. Just put it back. You didn't see it." John argued. He mentioned the porcelain doll, the tin soldier, the escalating decay of the items. Gary finally looked up, his expression empty and cold. "They are returns, John. The customers don't bring them back to customer service. They leave them. You just have to follow the process." Gary's instruction felt less like an order and more like an ancient ritual. John, terrified of losing his job and increasingly unnerved by the store's secrets, finally grabbed the melted lunchbox. He knew what he had to do. Carry the ruined item deep into the store's shadowy heart, towards the place where logic evaporated. He reached the boundary, the invisible line where the ceiling cameras stopped their silent vigil. Beyond was pure, unmoving shadow, far darker than any normal unlit corner. He could smell it now, a faint coppery scent mixed with something sickly sweet, like burnt sugar and decay. He could feel the cold radiating from the space, a temperature drop severe enough to prickle the hairs on his arms. The lunchbox felt suddenly heavier, almost vibrating in his hand. He took the final few steps into the threshold, plunging into the black.
The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was thick and heavy, pressing in on John's eyes and lungs. He reached out blindly, the smashed lunchbox a talisman against the encroaching void. His fingers brushed against something cold and slick, not plaster or steel, but a heavy, damp cloth that stretched endlessly. He realized the entire perimeter of the Lost Stockroom was sealed off, not by a wall, but by immense sheets of this material draped from ceiling to floor, a makeshift impenetrable barrier against the store proper. He kept moving, tracing the rough seam of the drapery with his free hand. The coppery, sickly sweet smell grew stronger, making his stomach clench. Then he saw it. A tiny gap, a fold in the thick barrier, revealing the source of the unsettling light. It wasn't electric. It was bioluminescent, emanating from something deep inside the restricted space, casting an awful, pulsing color. He carefully peered through the opening. The Lost Stockroom was not empty shelves or forgotten inventory. It was a cathedral of discarded things. Towering, disorganized piles of melted plastic, broken wood, and shredded fabric reached towards an unseen ceiling. The green light illuminated specific, unsettling objects. Thousands of identical, blank-faced dolls, all broken at the neck. This was the return bin. This was where the items too broken, too wrong for the main store were kept. But John realized that he wasn't just here to discard the lunchbox. He was here to place it on an offering shelf. In the center of the vast chamber, a single smooth black pedestal stood unnervingly empty. John pushes through the canvas and walks into the cavern. The camera tracks his movement towards the glowing black pedestal at the center. The towering piles of junk loom over him. The floor is covered in a gritty dust. His shoes crunch softly. The green light is now overwhelming. Lighting, intense, sickly green from the pedestal, casting harsh shadows. Pacing, the final walk, highly cinematic. Emotion. Finality, terror. The moment the melted plastic of the lunchbox touched the cold, obsidian surface of the pedestal, the overwhelming green light went dark. Total, suffocating blackness returned. But this time, it was accompanied by a wet, scraping sound that seemed to come from directly behind the towering piles of broken dolls. Something heavy was dragging itself across the gritty concrete floor, circling the vast mound of broken inventory. John spun, his small flashlight beam dancing wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of shattered toys and twisted metal. He had to find the opening back to the main store. But the perimeter cloth was gone. Where the barrier had been, there was now only an endless wall of shelving, stretching into the black distance. The entrance John had used to access the chamber was sealed off, absorbed by the store's impossible architecture. He was truly trapped within the Lost Stockroom. The scraping stopped. A chilling silence descended, heavier and colder than the darkness itself. John froze, flashlight beam fixed on the center of the room. He felt the entity's attention shift entirely to him, a predatory weight that crushed the air from his lungs. It was close now, hidden within the towering junk. A voice finally broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it was deep and dry, like old, worn leather. It spoke John's name not as a greeting, but as a confirmation, a realization. You are not a return. You are a donation. John's legs moved before his mind could process the words. He abandoned the flashlight, turning and running blind toward the only direction that felt even slightly less terrifying, deeper into the cavern, away from the voice. He only registered one thing about the entity before he fled. A single, pale, unblinking eye watching him from the deep shadow.
Your focus,
The dry voice scraped against the silence, reverberating off the towering junk piles. The constant attention you give the aisles, the way you categorize and count, it is a thing of great value here. We require it. The entity seemed to delight in the word, savoring the chilling implication. John knew what it meant. The store didn't want his body, it wanted his sanity. The endless, repetitive mental energy he expended, organizing and categorizing. He ran toward a faint yellowish glow, the first sign of normal life he'd seen since stepping into the black. The towering piles of merchandise suddenly became a labyrinth. They seemed to shift, blocking his direct path. He realized the piles were not static. They were actively guiding him, forcing him toward a different, much smaller doorway, barely visible in the darkness. He lunged for the metal door, his hands tearing at the rusty handle. It was locked, of course. Panic threatened to overwhelm him as he heard the scraping stop right behind the pile he'd just passed. The air grew frigid. He could feel the entity's breath on his neck, cold, dry, and smelling of burnt dust. He pressed his ear against the cold metal, desperate for any sound from the other side, a sign of the normal store, of life. Instead, he heard only a muffled, rhythmic sound, a child's quiet mechanical lullaby playing through the steel. It was horribly familiar, a sound he'd heard near the toy section during the day. He didn't wait to see the source of the stain. With a final adrenaline-fueled heave, John kicked out a rotten wooden grate near the floor of the doorway. It was a narrow, dusty crawl space leading beneath the foundations of the store. He plunged headfirst into the dusty, suffocating tunnel just as the thing in the darkness finally rushed forward. The crawl space was a hell of dusty insulation and forgotten wiring, but it offered protection from the colossal thing above. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of mildew and industrial exhaust. John scraped forward on his belly, his frantic movements muffled by the dirt. His only guide was the low, steady thrum of the building's massive foundations, vibrating through the earth itself. He realized the humming wasn't just machinery. It felt rhythmic, organic, like a vast, hidden heart beating beneath the acres of concrete. The store wasn't just built on the ground, it was deeply rooted in it. He stopped for a moment, pressing his ear against the cold, damp earth, listening to the impossible pulse. His goal was simple: follow the foundations back toward the main utility tunnels, the official maintenance paths that led outside. But as he crawled, he saw strange black cables running parallel to the plumbing. They were thick, slick, and strangely warm to the touch, and they led deeper into the darkness. Following the warm cables, John reached a larger, excavated space beneath the main sales floor, a pit. The cables terminated here, plunging into a dense mass of fibrous, woven material that resembled tightly packed old shopping bags and shredded packaging. It was the refuse of years, but it was also alive. Lodged halfway into the refuse pit, exposed by the light, was the horrifying answer to the missing coworker. Gary's frantic urgency to return the grotesque doll now made chilling sense. Sticking out of the woven mass was an employee name tag: David, Team Lead. It was faded, bent, and utterly empty beneath the name. The store hadn't just taken David. It had taken his essence, his focus, his presence, leaving only the shell of his identification. John knew then that the entity's demand for his focus was not metaphorical. He pushed away from the pit, the smell of burnt sugar and decay now overpowering. He had to escape before the store finished processing its newest donation. The realization that the black cables were closing in was immediate and paralyzing. They were not cables at all, but thick, smooth appendages tightening around his ankles with unnatural strength. John thrashed violently in the narrow space, kicking desperately at the slick, warm fibers that pulled him inexorably back toward the pulsing refuse pit. He managed to grip a thick, corroded copper pipe, part of the actual plumbing, and braced himself. The pulling force was immense, capable of dragging a grown man. He knew he couldn't break the cables, only tear himself free of their grip. The price of escape would be severe. With a final, terrified surge of adrenaline, John ripped his legs free, the fabric of his work pants tearing, and the skin beneath screaming in protest. The cables instantly retracted, sensing the loss of purchase, snapping back into the dirt and shadows near the pit with an audible thwack. He was free, but the cold sensation of them touching him lingered like a curse. He didn't look back. He followed the genuine utility pipe until it led to a vertical shaft, a small, old ventilation duct that smelled faintly of grease and cleaning chemicals. It was salvation. He kicked upward, breaking through the thin metal covering the duct's opening. He pulled himself up, emerging not onto the sales floor, but into the cramped confines of a custodian's storage closet. The scent of pine sol and bleach was overwhelming, a welcome antidote to the copper and decay of the pit. He was out. He was safe. The silence here felt genuine, not predatory. He leaned against the wall, trying to control his breathing. He was filthy, injured, and deeply traumatized, but he was alive. He had to get out of the store, alert the authorities, call the police. But as he staggered toward the closet door, he noticed a new addition to the cleaning supply shelf, sitting innocently right next to the disinfectant.
The sight of the brand-new lunchbox was a cold, brutal affirmation. The ritual was unending. The store was not simply disposing of broken things. It was cycling them, regenerating the discarded to force the next transaction. John understood then that his ordeal was not an escape, but a mandatory service initiation. He stumbled out of the closet, his senses reeling from the clean, oppressive normalcy of the main sales floor. He needed to find the exit, to smash the emergency glass and trigger the alarm. But the aisles, once familiar, now seemed impossibly vast, stretching and warping under the cruel fluorescent lights. He spotted the main exit doors, miles away at the front of the store, glowing like a false beacon. He ran, ignoring the pain in his legs, the metallic taste of fear coating his throat. As he ran past the electronics section, his reflection caught his eye in a massive flat-screen television. He finally reached the front security door. The panic bar gleamed, promising freedom. He slammed his body against it, but the door refused to budge. Locked. He tried again, screaming as he tore at the metal, but the store's massive structure held him fast. A voice spoke from the darkness of the closed customer service desk, calm and tired. "The emergency exit is for emergencies, John. Your continued presence is routine." It was Gary, standing perfectly still behind the counter, dressed in a fresh uniform, his face devoid of fear or exhaustion. "You must complete your loop," he continued, his voice echoing flatly. "The new item is ready for collection." He pointed a rigid finger toward the back of the store, toward the black corridors and the chilling promise of the Lost Stockroom. John looked down at his filthy, bleeding hands, then back at Gary's pristine uniform. As John started the long walk back toward the rear of the store, his head bowed in miserable acceptance, Gary's flat voice followed him. "There is one detail you missed, John, a critical part of the process." John paused, turning back slightly, his spirit already broken. Gary finally raised a hand, pointing not toward the aisle, but to the area where John had emerged from the crawl space. "You brought out dirt, filth, contamination.
The store floor must be pristine for the daytime transaction. You must clean up after yourself, John." The absurdity of the command to clean up his own blood and the dirt from his subterranean escape was the final twisted detail of this crazy scenario. Even in the face of supernatural horror, the demands of retail sanitation were absolute. John retrieved a mop and bucket from the now empty custodian's closet. As John scrubbed the trail of his own frantic terror, Gary spoke his last words to him. "The one you seek is not lost, John. He is only waiting for the perfect fit." David was too focused on the stock rotation. He forgot about the next item. John finished the cleaning, leaving the floor pristine. He knew Gary wasn't just a coworker. He was an extension, an avatar of the store's maintenance, a willing sacrifice who had traded his identity for routine. He turned his back on Gary and left the mop and bucket and walked toward the dimly lit back aisles to retrieve the brand-new lunchbox. He found the new lunchbox where he'd left it, pristine and mocking him from the cleaning shelf. He picked it up. It felt cold, perfect, and horribly empty. He knew the ritual now. Retrieve the new item, deliver it to the dark, and wait for the store's next demand. He took a final deep breath of the sterile store air. His focus was clear now, completely dedicated to the loop.
John walked past the abandoned service desk, his eyes catching sight of the supervisor's clipboard lying on the counter where Gary had stood moments before. He stopped. Taped to the clipboard was a single, laminated employee schedule. It was his schedule, but with a terrifying addition. Under the names of the night crew, Gary, Mark, Susan, a new name was scrawled in thick black ink. John, maintenance, permanent. But beneath his name, a chilling note was written. New focus, inventory retrieval, daily item slot, self-serve kiosk number 4. He realized his new life was now one of permanent internal maintenance. He was the next Gary, the willing servant bound to the store's eternal loop of collection and regeneration. The entity had consumed his freedom and replaced it with purpose, maintaining the perfect cycle of consumption and return. John turned, clutching the new empty lunchbox. His walk was no longer frantic. It was measured, steady, and exactly right. He entered the rear corridors, heading not for the terrifying Lost Stockroom, but for the perfectly ordinary self-serve kiosk number 4, his first task as a permanent employee of the store. He waited for less than a minute. From the back of the kiosk, the internal structure unseen by customers, a small dark bundle was silently extruded onto the counter. It was a child's bright red backpack, crushed and soaked with something dark. He picked it up. It was heavy, and it smelled distinctly of burnt sugar and decay. John turned, clutching the crushed backpack. His new duties had begun. The endless aisles stretched before him, beckoning him toward the shadow where the cameras never saw. He knew the way, and he knew the rules. He would return the item, and then he would wait for the store to tell him what to retrieve next, ensuring the loop would continue forever.